Hello, students. Coming to you on a Sunday evening in my office where I have been literally all weekend putting this all together. I'm pleased to present to you my very first electronic only, remote only presentation. Okay, so if everything is going well, and I certainly hope that it is, you should be able to hear my voice, you should be able to see my face, and you should be able to see me go through my PowerPoints. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to have generally a normal lecture, and this will be posted to my brand new YouTube channel. Okay, so in the way of announcements, please do be aware that there is a reaction paper due this Friday, and you will be submitting that on the course page. This is just the new reality that everybody has to get used to. So in the interest of getting you the material that you need in order to push forward and keep being successful, let's get into it. My material this week is all about crime and violence. Okay, so here's my agenda for the day. I will first give a little bit of data, just a little bit of background on crime in the United States, establish why it's important, although I don't think I need to do a terrible amount of time on that particular topic. I'll talk about some community characteristics, specifically the characteristics that reduce crime. It's a big mistake to just assume that if you have a poor area, you will have higher crime rates. There's definitely a correlation there, but the correlation is a little more complicated than some might think. Then we'll go into the concept of social disorganization theory and bring it full circle to the idea of segregation. Okay, let me get this out of the way. Okay, so crime tends to be when somebody says they don't like a city or they don't like cities in general. Often the ideology that is motivating that is one of fear of crime, and in some ways this is a very legitimate argument. I do understand that crime is scary, absolutely. Crime has the ability to determine the perception of a city, right? So when we talk about Detroit, for example, when we talk about certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles, when we talk about St. Louis, often the unstated or sometimes explicitly stated statement that people say about it, the first thing that comes up is, well, those are dangerous cities. They're not wrong. The data does absolutely back that up. So if a city develops a reputation for being unsafe, for being dangerous, for being violent, pick whatever adjective that you want, the reputation of the city can be very seriously damaged. We also see this happening with countries as well. For example, so at least some people in the room probably watch Narcos on Netflix. Really good show about the Colombian drug cartels the Colombian drug cartel in the late 80s and early 90s. And in 1992, 3, and 4, Colombia was the most violent country in the world. Today, that is simply no longer the case, right? The corruption has been rooted out. The gangs have been cleaned up. People have gone to prison. And today, Colombia has perfectly normal rates of homicide and violent crime compared to Latin American neighbors. But the reputation has never recovered, ever, right? Like people, like tourists still don't want to go there. We're just not seeing 20 years later, a recovery of the reputation from what it was when I was a little boy in the 90s. So the perception of the reputation of a city is often at stake. It determines residential choice. If you have the ability between living in a safe neighborhood and an unsafe neighborhood, what are you going to do? I mean, if you will choose this safe neighborhood, you can pretty much believe that many others will follow suit. These neighborhoods are not particularly pleasant for many people to live in, and that's something we'll get into in much more detail on Wednesday. It also determines business investments. So if a poor area develops a crime problem, then that means that the businesses have to pay much higher insurance rates to locate there. So some of them don't, and we end up with, okay, well, why is the area so poor? Well, there's no business here. Why are there no business here? Well, because the crime rates are high. Why are the crime rates so high? Because everything is so poor. And around in a circle we go. Now, as you're going to see throughout this lecture, it's a little more complicated than that, but we know this. High crime neighborhoods do not get outside investment, corporate investment, or even small business loans to get something off the ground. Now, the question becomes, in America, in the United States, is crime rising? Is it falling? Or is it holding steady? I'm going to give you 20 to 30 seconds just to think about that for a second, and then I will tell you the answer, because it's got to be one of those three, right? There's no other option. All right. If you said that crime is falling, you are absolutely correct. And this is something that tends to surprise some people. So, crime is something that in the post World War II era started to creep upward for a variety of reasons. It reached its peak around 1987, I believe. 1983 to 1987 was a very dangerous time frame, especially in urban areas. But since 1987, which was perhaps not coincidentally the year I was born, crime has very steadily declined. And so we're talking about 30 plus years of crime declines. And look, the rate has slowed a little bit over the last decade, but it's still going down, right? And just to put some numbers on this that might help illustrate this. New York City in 1977, the year that the city almost went bankrupt, New York City had over 1,300 homicides in that one year alone. And in 2017, so some, a time not too far, not too long ago, New York City had 332 homicides. So they cut 1,000 murders off of a city that had grown in population. That's an example of what criminologists today are calling the Great Crime Recession. It applies to both property crime and violent crime. Believe it or not, even though it doesn't feel like it right now, when it comes to crime, you are living through one of the safest periods in the country's history, and certainly the safest period since the end of World War II, the Great Crime Recession. Even though the United States has much higher levels of interpersonal violence and much higher levels of property crime than countries in wealthy industrialized democracies in East Asia, Europe, or Australia and New Zealand, nevertheless, the data is going in the same direction all across the world. But it doesn't always feel like that in cities. And that's because numbers can rise even when rates fall, right? It's all a matter of what the denominator of that equation actually is. So if we look at crime rates by the size of a metropolitan area, yeah, it's not your imagination. And this is, I'm upset by this. I don't like this. It does seem that a higher risk of crime and a higher perpetuation of crime may just be one of the risks of urban life. There are also risks to suburban life. There are also risks to rural life. In urban areas, it seems that the higher the population grows, we do see a rise in the rate of violent crime, and we do see a rise in the rate of property crime. Now, what is interesting about this is you can see that the property crime rate starts to rise from 17.4 to 28.2. I'll show with my cursor, and it's going up, and then we get up to 59.0, and then there's a real drop. There's a real decline to 44 counties with 1 million population or more. I highly suspect that that's driven by New York City, which is simultaneously the largest metropolitan area, the largest county in the entire country, and it is also one of the safest. Yeah, this idea when you watch Law and Order and you see them talking about New York City like it's some failed state, that argument is just not supported by data. New York City today is one of the safest cities in the world, let alone in the country. But as we go through, you can see that in larger cities, in larger counties, more people does equal more crime, right? From 3.2 per 100,000 people in the population up to 9.2 for those metro areas of 1 million or higher. I suspect that a big part of this is just an opportunity effect. If there's more people around you, the more likely it is. If you're looking to commit a crime, there's more targets. That's what is meant by an opportunity effect. Also, homicide rates all across the country always tend to spike during the summer. And it's because people are outside in the summer. People are more likely to be around each other. And when people hang out with each other in public places, the greater the likelihood of something violent happening. And so we see that every single year in Chicago, the months of June, July, and August tend to be the bloodiest months out of the year. It's well publicized in Chicago, but they're not the only ones, right? The summer months tend to be more violent just about anywhere. in the country. So it's not, while this does not mean cities are unsafe, this does mean that in some ways it is not your imagination. We do see a rise in the risk of victimization across time. However, if I look at a crime map, so what I did here was just use a mapping tool to give me 1 month of crime reports for a subsection of Detroit, Michigan, our closest metropolitan area. I have not taken the time to tally all that up or to count actually all of those types of crimes. But I will say, to my eye, just to the naked eye, that does look like a lot. However, our perception of crime is not always a rational thing. It's just not, right? Because what this is showing is it's not telling you how many people live in that area. It's not telling you how many people live in the entire city. It's just, if I have 10 crimes in an area of 100 people and I have 10 crimes in an area of 1 million people, it's a very different percentage that we can calculate out of that, out of those statistics. And I do think something similar happens like that with crime. I think we can look at maps like this and it seems like crime is rampant. It's all over the place. But rates ultimately help us understand how much is really too much. So if you remember on the slide just previously, I showed you those rates. Those are allow us to understand our risk factors and understand, who is actually at risk of becoming a victim of a crime. So take a minute to sort of just commit this map, this map of downtown Detroit and part of Midtown Detroit as well to memory. And now let's take a wide angle look at what is happening in the rest of the city. Okay, so what I have here is 4 maps that designate areas, neighborhoods, census tracts, more specifically, as either hotspots, cold spots, or not significant areas where the risk of crime is not statistically significant from the rate that is observed at the rest of the city. So let's start in the bottom left, robbery. It turns out that the area that I showed you on the map kind of corresponds to this area here that you see my mouse making a circle around. So it seems that there is a higher risk of robbery in that downtown corridor. But then when we look at burglary, which I admit I probably should know the difference to this. I suspect burglary is like breaking into your house or like stealing your car, whereas robberies are, muggings, holding you up for your wallet. I can see that while robbery might be a little more likely in this downtown area, burglary is way, way less likely. And where are the hotspots for that? In the northwest corner of the city, the south, this other west side neighborhood of the city, and in the far east side of the city. This area immediately surrounding downtown, it's actually far less likely. When we look at arson, that's all happening in the exurban areas of the city where there is just not a lot, where there's very high levels of vacancy. Then I look at homicide, downtown, not statistically more likely, and in fact is only in these more likely in these eastern or western clusters. So even though Detroit has a reputation for being a dangerous city and for being a high crime city, and part of that is actually quite justified, when I look at these neighborhoods and these census tracts here, I'm led to a fairly obvious conclusion. Crime is incredibly area specific, right? So I want to move beyond the idea or the mentality we have of this is a safe city and this is a dangerous city. No. You have to focus on the area. You got to focus on the specific neighborhoods to have really any sense of whether you're in a dangerous area or you are in, or you are in a dangerous area or not a dangerous area. Okay, so moving on then, many cities, even despite what I just said about like cities themselves not being dangerous and having small dangerous areas and not dangerous areas within the urban borders, it is true that many cities have a crime rate that is just stubbornly higher than the metro or the national average. So the 10 cities with the largest number of violent crimes, again, we are making a distinction there. We're just talking about violent crime per 100,000 residents in the United States. That's a typical normalization of population. We see that Detroit does actually have the highest violent crime rate, which is unfortunate, but it's not terribly higher than Memphis or Birmingham in 2 or 3. Baltimore, St. Louis, and Kansas City kind of round out the top 6, although there does appear to be a bit of a drop-off from St. Louis to Kansas City. Then we get to Cleveland, Milwaukee, Stockton, California, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, I have only grabbed a graph here that shows the violent crime rates for 10 metropolitan areas. But if I look at these cities, I see some patterns arising. I do see some patterns that may help me understand what actually makes a city prone to crime. Because again, I don't see Philadelphia here. I don't see New York City here. I don't see San Francisco, California here. But I do see, just for a few that really stand out to me, I see Detroit, I see Memphis, Baltimore, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. Those really stand out to me. So across these top 10, what are the commonalities that I observe? This is typically something I would ask students to, try to, do a little call and response thing. So I'm going to pause for a second just to look at this, let you look at this and see if you can, to yourself, come up with anything that these cities might have in common. All right. If you said that many of them have experienced dramatic deindustrialization, good job. That's one of the first things that I noticed. So Detroit, we've watched a movie about that. Cleveland, we watched a movie about that. These jobs that sustained the working class simply are not there anymore. Memphis has also been deindustrialized to all hell. Baltimore lost all of its shipping industry. St. Louis lost a huge chunk of its industry and is actually the only city in the country that lost a greater share of its population than Detroit did. Detroit lost more in raw numbers, but St. Louis is, if you normalize for that, it's actually smaller than it was at its peak than Detroit. Kansas City, I don't really have anything clever to say about Kansas City, but I suspect it's probably been prone to some of these similar things. And Stockton, California, maybe a city you've never heard of, used to have a lot of shipbuilding, and it has essentially zero manufacturing opportunities there. With Detroit, Cleveland still has some of it, right? St. Louis still's got some of it. Stockton's got nothing, and that's been catastrophic, for the city. Another thing that I see that these areas have in common. A lot of these cities are majority Black cities. Okay, so if we go to last week and we think about what segregated areas do, they keep people stuck in place, whether that is a good environment for them to be in or a bad environment for them to be in. And knowing the institutionalized discrimination that Black households face when they try to get to a new area or when they try to move into a certain maybe higher opportunity communities, it's clear to me that cities with very high levels of segregation and very high Black population, you combine that with many of the other things we discussed in the last couple of weeks, the skills mismatch, the spatial mismatch, you can see where my argument is going here. The places that end up having the highest levels of crime, who has the most oppressed and spatially locked population that cannot access the opportunities of the new economy. Now, on those lines, let's start talking about these factors that actually hinder crime, because understanding places that crime has not fallen in or perhaps has even increased is probably key to really understanding what's going on with the great crime recession. Let's talk about something that we, unfortunately, are very lacking at the moment as a college community and really as a country in the case of all this quarantine. Social ties. Social ties refer to the bonding and the bridging mechanism that connect people to one another. When we're connected to somebody, we form relationships with those people, and that does mediate our behavior. absolutely mediates our behavior. Now, when we have a lot of social ties that are geographically concentrated, that has the aggregate effect of holding people accountable to community standards, okay? So poverty, you introduce poverty and joblessness into this equation, that serves to erode the trust that people have in each other, right? Being poor is a deeply stressful situation. And what the poor have often really figured out and realized over time is that you almost can never be too careful. You always have to worry about somebody taking advantage of you, because if somebody does take advantage of you and you're middle class, okay, that sucks because you just got taken advantage of. But it's something that you can come back from, right, into the level of resources and money, income, things like that. For lower class individuals, for the working poor, if you get robbed, that might be a catastrophe for the month in a way that it isn't for higher socioeconomic status individuals. So poverty leads people to be a little bit less trustworthy. Therefore, it erodes the social ties that people have. It leads you to not try to develop relationships on the off chance that somebody might take advantage of you. Furthermore, a lot of poor urban residents rent. And it's not hard to see why that would be. It's hard to come up with 20% of a housing down payment when you can barely get through the month as it is. So we have much higher rates of renting in poor communities. Vacancy on top of that. So most people are renting. That increases turnover in a neighborhood. It makes it far less likely that you'll have the same neighbor over and over again. Like when I lived in Columbus, I remember moving into that. It was a neighborhood that a lot of grad students lived in. And I got the mail from like the last 40 people that lived there. It was ridiculous, right? It took years of living in that apartment before I was able to like even just start getting my own mail, and not a million other people that lived in that place before me. So when people are constantly cycling in and out, and also at a later date, I'll talk about the cycle of evictions, which also circulates people in and out. It's impossible for these neighborhoods to develop the kind of ties that might actually mediate behavior, that might actually create people in a population that's accountable to one another. Vacancy also removes the maximum number of ties that you might have available to you. Now, if we look at New York City, which was not on that list that I had previously, not on that list that I showed you of the highest highest crime cities in the country, New York City is known to have a very low rate of turnover. That's part of why it's so expensive. There's just not a lot of supply for the level of demand that New York City faces. But in my opinion, this is very much linked to the safety levels of New York City, right? There are poor areas in New York City, working class areas in New York City that the police don't worry about at all. You just do not have high rates of crime in those areas. And when you examine the nature of those neighborhoods, there's a high level of trust among the community residents, and there is a high level of trust that people are going to take care of each other, right? And perhaps that's not as high as it used to be. Perhaps it's not as high as we would like it. But we do see cities with the highest rates of turnover, and that almost always happens in poor neighborhoods of those cities. That does lead to a higher rate of crime. All right, I'm going to pause here for just a second. Let us all catch our breath. Okay. The measure of a social network, right? Trying to quantify somebody's social ties. I care about that at least because it leads into a more structural concept called collective efficacy. You'll remember the number of times I've said that I personally am obsessed with trying to quantify things that are not easy to quantify. Collective efficacy is a measure of how attached to others and to the neighborhood, right? To the cultural construct of the neighborhood residents are. When you have this high level of collective efficacy, it breeds an ability to work together on things, which the urban poor essentially need to do in order to get anything done. So if you think about two of the documentaries that we've watched up to this point, I want you to think about the community garden in Los Angeles. Those were minority farmers, generally poor or working class farmers, tons of them immigrants, and not groups of people that have a tremendous amount of political power. But what they had was a very clear attachment to each other and to the community, and it allowed them to do amazing things. They almost saved that garden, even in the case of the Wishes of the Growth Coalition. Okay, so this attachment then, it creates shared norms. It essentially becomes a value that this is our neighborhood and we're responsible for taking care of it, right? We are responsible for taking care of each other. That value creates norms on the ground level, and specifically it creates a population. If we have high levels of collective efficacy, people become willing to intervene on others' behalf and on the neighborhood's behalf, right? So how likely was it if you were screwing around in the street in the neighborhood that you grew up in, how likely was it that neighbors, like not your parents, right, not your family, but neighbors would yell at you if you were like a child kind of screwing around, damaging things? Like how likely is it that somebody would intervene on your behalf, right? And then you are intervene to put a stop to that. These small things, if they are let if the community doesn't take care of it, then it does send a bit of a message that larger things, right, larger offenses, nobody's going to really take care of that. Nobody is going to have the capacity to intervene on that. So the second documentary that I wanted to reference was the neighborhood in Detroit, right? So these neighborhoods in Detroit where I'm saying these kids had absolutely like nobody around them, high vacancy rates, no after school programs, like really no attachment to the neighborhood. And they talked about throwing rocks at police officers, setting buildings on fire, and seeing how long it took somebody to actually show up. And those are things that don't happen in functional neighborhoods. So what we see is that generally poor areas, and there are other metrics that matter here, they lack what is known as bridging and bonding social capital. Okay, social capital is this measure of who you know, and also kind of how well you know them and what they can connect you to. Bridging social capital is relationships you might have with people from outside the community. They link you to the broader socioeconomic fabric of your city and your society writ large. Poor areas also tend to lack bonding social capital, in that due to high turnover, due to vacancy, due to a lack of in-group trust, we simply do not see the close relationships that can help people survive what are very abnormal situations. So what you're seeing on this graph here over on the right, I pulled this out of a famous article by Robert Sampson, who studied this in Chicago. He's a University of Chicago sociologist and criminologist. Numbers that you're seeing here are correlation coefficients. They are measured between 1 and -1, where -1 is a perfect negative correlation and +1 is a perfect positive correlation. So the way you see the arrows going, if the number in between is negative, then that means it makes the outcome more likely. If it's positive, or less likely, pardon me. And if the number is positive, it makes the outcome more likely. So you just have these kind of three things on the sides of the triangle: collective efficacy, social disorder, and robbery. The closer a number is to one of the extremes, that is -1 or 1, the stronger that connection is. The correlation coefficient between collective efficacy and social disorder, right, the various trappings of a high crime neighborhood, collective efficacy makes social disorder less likely. People are intervening on behalf of the neighborhood, on behalf of their neighbors. Social disorder, however, once it sets in, it does make robbery more likely, right? It does make that, and again, it's not hard to see how that's connected to collective efficacy. If people aren't intervening on small things and social disorder has set in, then robbery itself becomes an outlay, becomes not a guarantee, obviously. You can see the number there is not very high. It's not exactly close to 1, but it does mean that robbery, people feel like they can get away with more generally. Then the connection between collective efficacy and robbery, we can see that if you have that, not only does collective efficacy reduce the chances of robbery, but Robbery itself reduces the collective efficacy. So in some ways, this is a self-fulfilling cycle. Why do we have robbery? Well, we didn't have collective efficacy, right? And I'm talking about this like this is things that I have on my bookshelf, right? I got collective efficacy, like I got that book right there on the shelf. No. The point I'm making is if collective efficacy starts to get reduced due to all these causal factors, well, then all of a sudden, robbery starts to become more likely. And the more that happens, the less people start to trust each other, the less people feel that they have the ability to even intervene on anybody's behalf in the neighborhood. And around in a circle we go. Okay, so what this measure of collective efficacy has been leading me towards is a discussion of social disorganization theory, which up to this point I have already described about 90% of, but we are missing one element of understanding why certain neighborhoods become stubbornly and persistently dangerous. Social disorganization theory is beautifully simple, and I do buy it generally. I do. The more disorganized a neighborhood is, be that physically or socially. By physically, I mean the state of the neighborhood, like the vacancy rate and the condition of the buildings, the condition of the streets, and then socially disorganized. Whether or not you have people going to work, like do you have a high rate of unemployment and joblessness? Do you have a very high rate of illegal behaviors already? That tends to produce higher rates of crime. Okay, because you have weaker social ties. People are not as connected to each other in these areas. You have weaker collective efficacy, and you have fewer mainstream opportunities. Once an area falls into physical disorganization and social disorganization, it's a lot less attractive for businesses to locate there or even in the vicinity of it. So that creates a lack of mainstream economic opportunities. We discussed this last week with social mismatch theory, with this idea that in a spatially mismatched city, we end up observing that people are just very far geographically removed from suitable job opportunities for them and things that ultimately could connect them to a way to earn mainstream money. Even if that's not very much, there are social benefits to that. In the absence of that, non-mainstream opportunities proliferate, and they do unfortunately become much more likely. So social disorganization theory flows as follows, right? We have the characteristics of a community and we have the social characteristics of individuals. So if you think about people that might be most at risk of offending, most at risk of committing crimes, they tend to be clustered in areas where there aren't a lot of opportunities, which is likely why they're most likely to commit the crime in the first place. So that brings us right to the issue of the community context. So in a jobless area, without strong ties, without collective efficacy, with very poor educational institutions, the community context becomes what is known, and you see this on the flowchart here, weak controls. The community itself, be it individuals or the community organization, is not able to exert normative control over individuals. This creates delinquency. Delinquency creates adult crime. And this is how the process tends to go. So I will return to, again, a concept from Wilson, because this very much is part of Wilson's theory, what he calls ghetto related behaviors, not ghetto specific behaviors, ghetto related behaviors. So within deeply isolated, socially isolated low income areas, it's not hard to see how the opportunity structure does not promote pro-social behavior. some scientists and really a lot of people love to throw around the term human nature. And that is a concept that doesn't make a lot of sense to a sociologist, and I suspect to many other academics as well. Saying what is human nature to me is almost like asking, like, what is the natural state of water? Okay, well, it can be a gas, it can be a liquid, it can be a solid, depending upon the environment that it is in. What is the natural state of human beings? It depends on the environment that they are placed in. Now, none of this is to take away the responsibility that I have and you have, and we all have, to not hurt people, right? That's a responsibility we have as part of the society that we live in. And if you hurt somebody, right? If you hurt somebody and do, irreparable physical or mental damage to somebody, you have to live with the consequences of that for the rest of your life, be those legal consequences or psychological consequences. But nevertheless, I don't need to excuse behavior in order to understand where it came from. And that's the key thing here. Okay? So then we get to this issue of segregation. This is what it's all been leading towards. Not only are Black neighborhoods the most segregated of any type of neighborhood in the country, they also have higher poverty rates than any other type of neighborhood in the country. So the article that we went through for today, Ruth Peterson and Lori Crevo, who were both professors that taught me actually at Ohio State, wrote this article in 2010 called Divergent Social Worlds. And they're arguing that even in the same city, segregated Black neighborhoods might as well be on another planet from stronger opportunity structure neighborhoods. And what we see is that comparably poor white counterfactuals just do not exist, okay? Even if you have white poverty, and that does exist, don't get me wrong, that totally exists, but they are not nearly as isolated from the opportunity structure of the city or the society that they are embedded within, okay? So if we look through the article, you'll see that just throughout the country, 90% of white areas actually have low poverty. You may have white poverty in those areas, but 90% of these areas are not concentrated poverty. I will repeat that. The vast majority of white areas, while they might have poor people, they are not examples of concentrated poverty. And to me, that's very important. To me, that's absolutely crucial to understanding the well-being of the poor population in the United States, whatever color they happen to be. Meanwhile, only 25% of minority areas actually have low poverty. Okay. Now, the way I interpret that is within those areas, like you do not have uniform Black poverty, like at the individual and household level. But even Black households that are doing well are often living much, much closer to poverty than many whites are, especially in urban areas, because a lot of white poverty, which can be dramatic in some cases, it tends to be rural outside of just a few specific cities that tend to house it. So what you're seeing on this graph here, violent crime rates for neighborhoods of different colors. Okay, you can see that in white neighborhoods, right? This is the effect of segregation. In white neighborhoods, the violent crime rate tends to be very low. You look at Black African-American neighborhoods, not only is the mean much higher, but whoa, look at the standard deviation on this. That's a preposterous level of variability within the distribution here, okay? And so it shows you that while you have some very safe neighborhoods, you also have some extremely violent neighborhoods and everything in between. Compare that to Latino minority and integrated neighborhoods. There is absolutely no group that is more segregated from mainstream opportunities than African Americans. There just is no group more isolated from those opportunities, which makes the ones that succeed all the more impressive. Then when we look at this at the level of a correlation, right? Is there an actual correlation between segregation and violent crime? It turns out that there is. So what you're seeing here is an XY axis. On the x-axis, that is the index of dissimilarity. As that increases, it means that segregation is getting more severe. And on my y-axis, I see violent crime rates. the trend line is going upwards. More segregated environments, higher violent crime rates. And these particular ones here are what's known as outliers. They are not only the most segregated places, but they also tend to be the most dangerous urban areas ultimately in the country. And so that's where you'll see your St. Louis's, Detroit's, so on and so forth. Oh, another thing, I meant to say this earlier, and I guess I just forgot. It seems to me that when people say such and such of a city is a very dangerous thing, a lot of times the example that comes up next is Chicago. And maybe that is worth saying. But at the same time, Chicago didn't even crack the top 10 on that list that I showed you. Not even top 10. So that's yet another example of my argument of crime just being very area specific. There are some neighborhoods in Chicago that I think are very dangerous places. But there are also large chunks of Chicago that have a much better opportunity structure. And therefore, the challenge of Chicago is how to cut down on its endemic segregation that tends to trap people within neighborhoods that have become very socially disorganized. So, to bring this full circle here, industry is something that created thriving for a time, but very fragile communities. And that level of fragility was badly exposed once the jobs that supported those communities just went away. Okay, so segregation concentrates people of an ethnic background, but we have already argued, right? I spent a lot of time arguing that segregation is not about who you're living around, but what resources you have access to. So let's think about what else segregation does. Not only does it concentrate groups of people and create racial inequality, it's concentrating poverty. And it's usually not a good idea to concentrate poverty. You end up with what can become a very desperate population in some cases. This is precisely why public housing high-rises, which were all built in the 60s, 70s, and some in the 80s, kind of didn't work. So if you are familiar with Pruitt-Igoe, which was a series of public housing projects in St. Louis, if you're familiar with Cabrini Green in Chicago on the near south side of Chicago, these massive towers, very high-rise towers that were used as public housing for the city's poor population. They gave people places to live. It also became hell on earth because it was the trapping of human misery with no ability to really access the resources that people would have needed to improve their lives. It also concentrates joblessness. Wilson writes at length about this, about how it's not good for young people in a community to grow up seeing so many of their adults and role models within the community out of work. It's not good to see so many people going in and out of jail. Now, the jail thing, I realize it's not good to kind of just throw that out there, just sort of in a laissez-faire way. On Friday, I'm going to be talking in much more detail about mass incarceration and its effect on Black urban neighborhoods. But for now, it's still, I think we can all agree, it's not good for children when adult males in particular are constantly going away to prison. That's not good. That sets a very bad example for how your life is going to go. It sets a very bad expectation for what happens to adults in your neighborhood. It concentrates poor skills, right? Usually as a result of poor education systems and poor institutions that might be able to invest in those people there. And that's all concentrated together. Concentrates informal economies. You got to make money somehow. Many people do so through illegal ways in the absence of legal ways to pursue a livelihood and a well-being. And then most importantly, and this is to me, I personally feel this is what really kills a community. Poverty's bad and joblessness sucks and poor skills are not good for people. But what really destroys a community, destroys the social cohesion of a neighborhood, is when a sense of hopelessness sets in. Hopelessness ends up being the absolute death knell of a community. In other words, all of these things being concentrated, that sounds to me like a very socially disorganized neighborhood. Now, as for where we go from here, as for where we go next, when people talk about urban crime, they're not usually talking about your bike getting stolen, although that might happen to people. I'm not usually getting mugged at the train station, although that happens to some people too. Violence. Violence is usually the number one fear of individuals in urban areas. When a neighborhood develops a reputation or develops a high rate of interpersonal violence, this wreaks havoc on the lives of inner city residents of that community. And it does so in a way that creates a divergent type of subculture that may help people navigate that neighborhood, but does not help them navigate mainstream society. That is what the reading for Wednesday and the lecture for Wednesday will generally address. All right. So thank you very much for listening to me. I will see you on Wednesday. Thanks so much. This was the best I could do on what is very short notice. I really believe that each one from this point on will get better. Thank you very much.